All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Meir and Rachel Gold, for dedicating all the Shir and Roshos this month in memory of Yonah, Tzvi, Ben Yosef, Chaim, Elazar, HaKohen, Zichron Lebracha, and Noam and Leah Efron, for dedicating all of the Shir and Roshos this month in honor of the celebration of the 98th birthday of Noam's grandfather, Yosef Hershel, Ben Mordechai Halevi. We thank both of our sponsors for their incredible generosity. And I will say with that, let us begin. Let us begin. Okay. Good. We'll see a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf Vav. And we are picking up in Meir Hashem, page 6. We are picking up on daf Hey Amud Beis, 5b. And we are picking up V'haya B'cha Chet, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, we're darshaning the brisa. We had a very long brisa that went through a variety of different cases of Baal Ta'acher. Our primary subject is still the general discussion regarding the five-way machlokes concerning Baal Ta'acher. So remember again, the Gemara then quoted, the brisa then quoted V'haya b'cha chet v'lo b'karban chet. Also remember again, we spoke about this yesterday, not just mitzad halacha, but mitzad the hashkafa as well. I don't have to repeat it again. What does this mean? I will say on the halachic level. Which means even if you are in violation of Baal Ta'acher, your karban is not invalid. In other words, I will say, I might have thought that once I'm in violation of Baal Ta'acher, the karban is invalid as well. Kamash malan that that's not the case. Kamash malan that even though again you're in violation, the karban could still be offered. So the Gemara says, "V'hameh hachanafka." Do we learn out that even after a karban, or even after the owner of the karban, so to speak, is in violation of Baal Ta'acher, that the karban could still be offered? Do we learn that out from this pasuk? Midahasam nafka. I'm sorry, midachirim nafka. We learn out from the achirim. What did the achirim say? Tisanya achirim omrim yachol yehi bachar sha'avra shnasal b'psulei hamikdashin v'yifsal. So I'll say you might have thought as follows: a bachar. Right, the bachar is supposed to be is given over in its first year. What happens if the year elapses? Right, you might have thought that such an animal should be such a bachar, such an animal should be treated like psuli hamokdashin, right? Other like a balmum. Rashi says. First of all, take a look at Rashi. Sha'abra shnaso mitzvaso b'soch shnaso shene'emar lifnei Hashem elokecha tochlenu shana b'shana. Right, so there's a mitzvah to go and offer up the bachar within the year. You might have thought that if you don't offer up the bachar within the year, that the bachar is treated like an animal that's a balmum, and therefore cannot be offered. Talmud lomar v'achalt lifnei Hashem elokecha ma'asar degancha siroshcha v'yisarecha u'bechoros bekarcha v'tzonecha. So we'll say the pasuk says, "You shall eat before Hashem the meiser, the tithes of your grain, your olives, your wine, bechar, and the firstborn of your oxen, your sheep." So we'll say the Gemara says, "Makish bechar lemeiser." The Torah equates bechar to meiser to teach you what? Ma meiser eino nifsal mishran lechaverto. Just like if for some reason you did not dispense, you did not give away your tithes in the designated year. So we'll say that does not negate the tithe, right? That does not negate the meiser. Okay, you delayed, so you might be in violation of delaying, but you still go ahead and dispense the meiserus. Af bechar eino nifsal mishana lechaverta. So to bechar ultimately again is not invalidated if it's not offered up in its first year. Which I will say, so the Gemara is pointing out over here, you see from here that even if you delay something, right, even if at the end of the day you do not offer something up in its designated time and you delay, so ultimately what? Even though you're in violation of a lav, or in violation of a lav and an assay, the karban could still be offered. So just let's see what's happening over here. No one is disputing the fact. In other words, we darshan from the brisa. The pasuk was v'haya b'chachet. Right? If you delay, you will be in violation of an avera. We darshan you'll have the avera, but not your karban. I.e., you could still offer up the karban even if you're in violation of Baal Ta'acher. To which the Gemara says, we don't learn that concept from here. We learn that concept from a different pasuk. To which the Gemara says, it's derech. You need both pasuk, and I'll tell you why. Sagadait chamina hani mili bechar delav bar hartzahu. See, I will say, if you would have just had the pasuk that the Gemara just quoted, v'yachal tefnei Hashem lokecha masar degan chas yoshcha, where the Torah is equating bechar with Meiser, I might have thought that it's only Bechar that could be offered up even after you've been in violation of Baal Ta'acher. Why? Because Rabbi say a Bechar the lav bar hartzahu, right? A Bechar doesn't affect any level of atonement. In other words, a Bechar is a carbon I have to bring, but Lamaisa, it does not have any atonement component, right? Or really true carbonic component. The Gemara says, aval kodshim tibnei hartzaninu ema lo lirtzu, but other karbanos which do affect atonement, I might have thought the Havamina would have been that if you miss the window, if you're in violation of Baal Ta'acher, perhaps the carbon itself no longer atones and therefore cannot be brought. Therefore, Kamashal, that's not the case. So it turns out that I really have two psukim that actually teach me the same halacha, right? Just by two different situations. The pasuk which is quoted above, teaches me that even if you don't offer up the Bechar in the first year, you could still offer it up. And V'haya B'chachit teaches me that by any other carbon, even after I'm in violation of Baal Ta'acher, I could still offer up the carbon. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, V'akati mit ben azai nafka, but one second. Can't we still learn this out from the statement of Ben Azai? What did Ben Azai say? Top of Vav, Tisanya, Ben Azai Omer Oso. Matam Lomer. So we'll say, why does the pasuk say Oso? Now, what are we talking about over here? The pasuk the Gemara is quoting over here is by Pigul. So remember again, what's Pigul? Pigul is a Kohen. The pasuk is Vim heachel yiachel mi basar zevach shlama b'yom hashlishi lo yiratzam akriv oso lo yichashev. Lo pigul yiyah va'nefesh ha'ocheles mimeno avona tisa. So we'll say over here the Torah is talking about the disqualification of pigul by sacrificial items. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Matam oso matam lomar lefi shene'emar lo sacher l'shalmo. The pasuk says in general, when you make a neder, do not delay in going ahead and offering your neder. Shomea ani af ma'acher nidro bebal yiratzeh. I would have thought that ultimately, once you're in violation of Baal Ta'acher, you can't offer up the carbon anymore. Or perhaps the carbon is no Afka said by Pigul, Oso below yiratzeh ve'in ma'acher nidro below yiratzeh. It's only something like Pigul, which cannot be offered up on the Mizbeach, but ultimately, again, other karbanos, even if you've been in violation of Baal Ta'acher, can be offered up on the Mizbeach. So we'll say, so once again, what the Gemara is just pointing out over here is, there's another source. So we'll say, the good news in these types of discussions is everyone is agreeing on the conclusion, right? The conclusion is that even if the owner of the carbon is in violation of Baal Ta'acher, the carbon could still be offered. Or to use a little bit of brisker terminology, Baal Ta'acher is an Isser on the Gavra, not on the Cheftza. Right? So Baal Ta'acher is a prohibition that devolves upon me, the owner, right? The Gavra, the individual. But it in no way has an impact on the Cheftza, on the carbon itself. A very important distinction. So now the point the Gemara is making over here is, the Brisa made this sound like that we are learning this concept from the pasuk of V'haya b'cha chet. The chet of Baal Ta'acher is on you, is on the owner, v'lo b'karbancha, and not on your carbon. What the Gemara is just pointing out, the question that the Gemara is repeatedly asking is, we see other sources for this halacha. So now we just quoted Ben Azai, and Ben Azai gives another explanation for this halacha, to which the Gemara says, you're right. We don't learn it out from Ella b'chachet. Rather, what do we learn out? Listen to this. This is incredible. So the Gemara says, Ella b'chachet v'lo b'ishtachachet. Rather, Rabbi said the drasha is, v'haya b'chachet, if you are in violation of Baal Ta'acher. If you are in violation of Baal Ta'acher, that chet is on you and not on your wife. What does that mean? Well, say this is actually an incredible Gemara. You would have thought as follows: Hoil v'am Rabbi Yochanan v'tim Rabbi Elazar, ein ishto shel adam mesa, ela imkin mevakshin mimenu mamon ve'ein lo. We'll say very profound Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar says a man's wife does not pass away unless, of course, he owes money mevakshin mimenu mamon ve'ein lo, and he does not repay it. So I will say this is referring, first of all, so in general, whenever Chazal makes statements like this, then Ein Ishto Shel Adam Meiseh Ela Im Kain. It's not meant to say that this is the only situation that causes a person's wife to pass away. Life is much more complex. But Chazal are highlighting a yesod, that at the end of the day, if a person owes money and they do not pay back that money, assuming they have the money, but they don't pay back the money, ultimately, again, as a result of that aveira, so a person loses his wife. Shene Emar, Im ein lecha l'shalem, lama yikach mishkavcha mitachtecha. Ultimately, if you don't have money to pay, why? Literally translated, why should I take the bed from underneath you? So the bed from underneath you is a metaphor to one's wife. So the Gemara says over here, you might have thought. Now this is fascinating. So you might have thought, Ema b'hai avon debal ta'acher nami ishto mesa. So ultimately, again, so what the Navi was saying, what Shlomo Melech is saying over here in Mishlei, is if a person owes money, and they have money, but they don't repay their debts, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you have, but you don't pay, I'll take from you what you have. In other words, we'll repay the debt in a different way with something else that's yours. So again, it's talking about someone who has, but ultimately at the end of the day doesn't repay. So the Gemara says, you might have thought that Baal Ta'acher, this would apply to Baal Ta'acher as well. And ultimately, again, if a man is in violation of Baal Ta'achar, which is the same yesod, I have, I should pay, I don't pay. Perhaps in that, the result of that particular aveira, a person should chas v'shalom lose their wife. Kamash malono. Kamash on the Gemara says, v'haya b'cha chet, v'lo b'karbancha chet. Sorry, v'lo b'karbancha, or v'lo b'ishtecha chet. That ultimately, again, the chet of Baal Ta'achar is in you, but ultimately, again, not in your wife. So we'll say, just to spend a moment on this, because it's a very dramatic Gemara. So what's the pshat and what's the correlation to owing money, not paying back, and chas v'shalom, the loss of one's wife? What's the connection between those things? So we'll say, perhaps it's like this. If a person borrows money and they owe money, so that relationship is very often predicated on one's word. You made a commitment. You made a promise. I borrowed $1,000 from Ruvain. I made a commitment to go ahead and pay back that money. Failure to pay that back, when you have it, it's not talking about if you don't have it. Failure to pay that back, if I have it, is a failure to honor my word, a failure to honor my commitment. So perhaps like on a deeper level, what Chazal were trying to express is that if you're a person who doesn't keep your word, and you're a person who doesn't keep your commitments, you're also a person who's not going to keep your marriage. Because at the end of the day, marriage is a commitment, and it's predicated on the making of promises and the keeping of promises. But at the end of the day, if you make commitments, you make promises, and you just don't live up to them, at the end of the day, there is no marriage left. In other words, the taking of the wife doesn't have to refer to death. The taking of the wife could also just simply refer to the dissolution of marriage. Many times when Chazal say things like this, both say, it's like, there's another statement like this, there's a juxtaposition between the bringing of Bikurim and Sota, Parsha Sota. And Rashi has an interesting statement. Rashi says, why are they juxtaposed? Because if you don't go to see the Kohen by bringing Bikurim, you're going to go to see the Kohen by bringing your wife as a Sota. Like, what does that mean? Right? What's the connection there? So I will say, I think there's a very simple yesod. Bikurim is generosity. Bikurim is the taking of things that are rightfully yours and ultimately giving them to the Kohen, giving them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Perhaps what Chazal are expressing is, if you don't have generosity in your marriage, if you are not a giving, selfless person in your marriage, if your marriage is about what you get and not what you give, that marriage is done. You'll see the coin for Sota, meaning metaphorically, that marriage is going to very quickly unravel, because everyone needs to feel that someone loves them, and everyone needs to feel that someone's giving to them. And if a man's not giving that to his wife, at the end of the day, that marriage will quickly unravel. So you see that I think begin to see a pattern that sometimes Chazal express these type of, I think these marriage etzos in very stark terms, right? Almost to be able to highlight that marriage is a very fragile thing. And if you're not putting all of you into it, it's going to unravel and it's going to go. And it's maisim b'chol yom that unfortunately, again, people find themselves in bad relationship predicaments and they have no idea how they got there. And meanwhile, it's the result of years and years of just systemic neglect. And you wake up one day and there's no relationship there anymore. So here Chazal are saying, at the end of the day, do you honor your word? I will say, whether it's that, I'll be home at 6 o'clock. Are you really home at 6 o'clock? Right? Whether it's that we should really make a date night. Do you really make the date night? Whether or not it's a whole bunch of other things, the commitments we make to our spouses. Do we honor them? Because if we're not men of our word, then unfortunately, again, the relationships quickly unravel. The Gemara goes right to Tana Rabbanon. Motzei svasecha zu mitzvah saseh. So we'll say now the Gemara Darshans another beautiful pasuk over here. So the pasuk over here, just to give you the pasuk in its totality, and then we'll break it up. The Torah says, "Motza svasecha tishmar va'asisa." The words of your mouth you shall keep, va'asisa, and you will fulfill them. Kasher nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha, as you vow to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nedava asher dibarta beficha, nedava that you spoke out with your mouth. So the Gemara says as follows: So motza svasecha zu mitzvas aseh. So this is a positive commandment. Tishmar, so we'll say, in other words, a positive commandment that, first of all, it's fascinating. There's a positive commandment to do what you said you're going to do, which is interesting, right? A mitzvahs aseh, that when you say something, you make a commitment, do it. Tishmar, keep it. Zu mitzvahs lo saseh, that's ultimately, again, a prohibition not to follow through on that which you said. I will say, of course, this is karbanically oriented. You could, of course, globalize all of these messages as life messages as well, but they are specifically karbanically oriented. Lo saseh v'asisa, and you shall perform it. Azhar lebezdin shiasucha. Both say this is incredible. If I pledge a carbon, and ultimately, again, I am not bringing it. So I said, I'm bringing this shlamim, and I don't bring it. Bezdin has a moral obligation to force me to do it if I am not doing it of my own volition. I want to be clear what's happening over here. We're talking about I've designated a carbon. I'm just not bringing it. So Bezdin has a moral obligation to force me to bring it. Kasher nadarta, as I vowed, zen neder. This refers to a neder. La Hashem Elokecha, to Hashem your God. Ilu chatos, hashamos, olos, ushlamim. This refers to all these other types of karbanos. Nidava, what does nidava refer to? Kimashmo, nidava is a nidava. Asher dibarta, that which you have said. Elu kache bedekabais. This refers to things that you pledged to bedekabais, temple upkeep. Beficha, with your mouth. Zu tzedakah. This refers to vows of tzedakah, charitable vows. So we'll say, so therefore this whole pasuk is talking about the various commitments you make. There is an asay to honor the commitment, a lo sasay if you don't honor the commitment, and Bezdin has an obligation to force me to honor the commitment if I am not doing this of my own volition. Amar Mar, motzas svasecha zu mitzvahs asay lamali. Why do I need the asay to come from motzas svasecha? After all, mi ubasa shama v'havesim shama nafka. I can learn now from the pasuk that says, ubasem shama v'havesim shama. You shall come and you shall offer it up. So the Gemara says, Tishmar zu mitzvahs lo saseh lamali. Why do I need Tishmar? First white line above, vavam and aleph. Why do I need Tishmar to teach me a lo saseh? Mi lo sa'acher l'shamal nafka. I have an explicit lo saseh. Do not delay from paying your debts. Vasisa azhar lebezin shiasucha lamali. Why do I need vasisa as a commandment, as a command to the Bezdin to force me to bring my karbanos if I have not been doing it on my own? So the Gemara says, lamali mi yakriv oso nafka. This sanya, also listen to this. We learned this from another drasha. Yakriv oso. This sanya, yakriv oso. Now we'll say the lashon of yakriv oso. The Gemara is darshaning over here to mean they will cause him to be makriv. What's the case of they being causing him to be makriv? This is incredible. Shekofin oso. The Bezdin literally will force a guy to bring his carbon. I will say, I want to be clear. not just that Beis Din will force a guy to bring a carbon. If he has an obligation, well, we'll discuss the parameters of this. He has an obligation, maybe he's even verbally committed or set aside a carbon. He's not honoring his commitments. He's made the commitment already. He's not honoring the commitment. Beis Din steps in and uses force to force him to go ahead and honor his commitment. Yachol bal karcho, you might have thought to even force him to do this against his will. The problem is that doesn't work by karbanos. Why? Talmud lomar liritzono. Because we all say a pasuk has to be, a carbon has to be offered, right? With the will, right? With the free will of the bala carbon. So how do you reconcile these two ideas? On one hand, you have the Beis Din has the ability to coerce the individual to go ahead and to offer up the carbon. On the other hand, it has to be liritzono, according to his will. Ha-ketzad, kofin oso ad sheyoma rotza'ani. Beis Din forces him until I said, you know what, you're right, I saw the light. I want to go ahead and offer up this carbon. So I'll say we apply pressure until he acquiesces. So at the end of the day, it's got to be liritzono. The question is, the path to ritzono could take different ways. Hopefully people find their true ratzon on their own, but if they need a little bit of help with the strong arm of Beis Din to be able to find their true inner will, then ultimately Beis Din is not only empowered, but Beis Din is obligated to do so. I will say we know this concept most notably from Gittin, right? That kofin osu achiyome rotza'ani, we force a husband, which will say, by the way, you don't realize that one of the things that we lack most in our current state we don't have organized Jewish community, even in Eretz Yisrael, which has a rabbanut and a Beis Din system. It's not nearly what it used to be. What we truly lack is this ability of Beis Din to actually have strength, this ability of Beis Din to actually affect change, because that ability, we know that the aguna problem is such a profound problem, and although we have some mechanisms to be able to proactively deal with that, a recalcitrant husband is one of the worst forms of rishus that exists within Klal Yisrael today. And it's a real problem. And without an organized Beis Din system, that kofin oser achiyom erotzani, which was a very, very, very powerful tool, is no longer really here. So in any event, the Gemara says as follows. Yair, if you need a Gemara, under the second table over there, there's a Gemara. So the Gemara says as follows. So therefore, again, the point that the Gemara is making is that halacha l'maisa, you're going ahead and you're learning out this ability or this obligation of Beis Din to coerce from one pasuk. We learn out from a different pasuk, to which the Gemara says both psukim are necessary, and I'll tell you why. Chad da'amar v'lo afrish, v'chad afrish v'lo akrib. Listen to this. One case is talking about a situation where da'amar, where I said, I hereby take upon myself to bring an olah, but I didn't separate out a carbon. The other case is talking about a situation where I separated out the carbon, but I didn't yet offer it. And therefore, two different psukim are telling me whether I verbally accepted the obligation but didn't separate out the animal, Beis Din has an obligation to force me to bring it. Or even if I already separated it but didn't yet offer it, in that case, also, Beis Din has an obligation to force me. I need both cases. Why? If you would have just said a case of where I accepted upon myself the obligation, but I didn't yet separate out the animal, because in that case, Beis Din should force me because I made a verbal commitment, which is enough to create a carbonic obligation, and I'm not honoring my commitment. But in a case where I designated the animal already, but I just didn't yet offer it up, I would have thought that maybe in a case where I designated the animal, Beis Din doesn't get involved. Why not? Because once I've designated the animal, it's pretty much already in the rishus of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Beis HaMikdash already owns it. So once they already own it, it's my business to get it to the Beis HaMikdash, but Beis Din doesn't get involved in that. Tzricha, therefore we need to say no, even in that case, where you already designated the animal, but are derelict in bringing it as a carbon, Beis Din gets involved and forces you to do it. And if you would have just told me the case of where I separated out the animal, but I haven't offered it up, Beis Din gets involved and forces me to offer it. But in case where I just verbally accepted upon myself to bring a carbon, but didn't designate an animal, maybe I'd say, you know what, that's nothing. A verbal commitment is nothing, and therefore maybe Beis Din doesn't get involved in that at all. Therefore, tzvicha. So therefore, I will say whether I said, I hereby accept upon myself to bring an olah, but I didn't separate that animal, or I separated an animal but didn't offer it up, in either of those situations where Beis Din sees that I am unnecessarily delaying in fulfilling my obligation, Beis Din gets involved and forces me to go ahead and fulfill my obligation. Incredible. Umi matzis amris, the amr v'lo afrish. Can you actually set this up as a case where a person accepted the obligation of a carbon upon themselves but did not separate out the animal? V'hanedava ksiva. The context of this pasuk is in adava. And I will say, what's the nature of an adava? Utnan, ezehu neder. What's a neder? I will say is interesting. What is a neder? Haomer hare alai ola. A person who says, I hereby accept upon myself the obligation to bring an ola. That is a neder. And what is an adava? Ve'ezu nedava. Haomer hare zu ola. An adava, will says, where a person says, that animal, designate a particular animal, that's an adava. Or Rabbi said to use our same terminology as before. A neder is on the gavra, right? A neder is an obligation I take upon myself. A nedava is on the cheftza, on the object. Rabbi say, what's the nafkamina? A very profound nafkamina. Uma bein neder l'nedava. What's the nafkamina? Here we go. Neder meis o nignav chai b'achriyusa. Both say, if I accept upon myself to bring an ola as a neder, and then what happens? I had in mind to bring a particular animal. I didn't actively designate it, but I had in mind to go ahead and bring it, and it dies. What's the halacha? You have to separate out another animal. Nidava meisa o nignava in chai b'achriyusa. But if you identified, if you made nidava, where again the obligation is on the chevtza, and the chevtza dies, the animal dies, or is lost, or is stolen, I have no obligation for replacement. Interesting halacha. So I will say the point over here is, the pasuk's talking about nidava. Nidava is when you actively separate an animal to be offered up. So the Gemara is saying, but one of the cases we're talking about is where a person made a verbal commitment but didn't separate out an animal. But that doesn't work because that's not nedava. So to which the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Mishkachas lo kigon da Amar, Hare alai ola. Almenas shini chai b'achriyusa. Rava says, what's the case? The case is where a person says, Hare alai ola, which I will say is what kind of lashon? What kind of lashon? A neder. But they say on the condition that I am not chayiv if anything happens to the animal. So I'll say this is interesting. This is like a hybrid because you're saying hare alai, which is a neder, but I have no achrayis if something happens to the animal, which is what? Which is nedava. So we call that a nedava. We call that a nedava because at the end of the day you don't have responsibility if something happens to the animal. But in its essence, it's really a neder. Okay, interesting. Beficha, both say fascinating sugya. Beficha, any commitments you make with your mouth, what does that refer to? Zu tzedakah. This refers to commitments I make to tzedakah. That Allah Chalamai said, if I make tzedakah commitments, I have to honor them in an expeditious fashion. And I will say, now what it sounds like over here is that tzedakah commitments are also governed by Baal Ta'acher, which is very interesting because tzedakah has nothing to do with karbanas. So now we're going to qualify that. Amar Rava, Utzdaka mechayv alei me'alter. Rava says, no. Even though tzedakah is included in the Baal Ta'acher discussion, at the end of the day, if you make a pledge to tzedakah, you have to pay that immediately. There's no three regalim over there, right? If you make a pledge to tzedakah, you have to pay. All this assumes that a person has the funds, right? But if you make a pledge to tzedakah, ultimately, you have to pay it immediately. My timer, what's the reason for that? This is incredible. Kaime aniyim. Because when it comes to tzedakah, kaime aniyim means what? The poor are right in front of me, which is another way of saying that when it comes to tzedakah, the need is immediate. See, this is actually fascinating. People say, why is there a constant Baal Ta'acher? In other words, why don't we say that as soon as you go ahead and you make it, you take upon yourself the obligation to bring a carbon, when should you have to bring it? When should you have to bring it? Tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, get on the bus, right? Get on the donkey, right? Go. See, the difference is because it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's fine. Okay, I don't need your kabbanas to begin with, so it's no problem. Just I want you to be people of your word. I want you to honor your commitment. But there's a window. The Gemara says when it comes to tzedakah, the need is immediate. The need is the hakami aniyim. The need is immediate. And I both say, brother, aniyim doesn't just have to mean tzedakah to the poor. It means anytime you make a commitment of tzedakah, that need is immediate. Because the need is immediate, the obligation for payment is immediate as well. So the Gemara says, pshita, but that's obvious. You might have thought that since tzedakah is mentioned in the context of karbanos, therefore what? Therefore halacha l'maisa, it should have the same din as karbanos. That just like karbanos has 3 regalim, so too tzedakah has 3 regalim as well. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon, it's written in the context of karbanos to say, just like by karbanos you have to keep your word, so too by tzedakah you have to keep your word. But just like by karbanos you have 3 regalim to keep your word, by tzedakah the obligation to pay your obligations is immediate. So we don't have time for it now, but I will say something very interesting. So I'll say there's a lot of interesting discussion in general about hilchos tzedakah like this, because from the Gemara, what it makes it sound like is if you have tzedakah, you have to give it immediately. So we'll say, what happens if a person has, like, it's a good idea to set up a Meir account. A Meir account, right, where a person gets paid or a person makes money. I want to separate it out into account and I want to put it in a Meir account. Is that okay? Or is there an obligation to dispense it immediately? So we'll say most of the posts can bring down that the obligation to quote unquote give tzedakah immediately means the obligation to separate tzedakah immediately. You can't let ma'os tzedakah, or what is most often ma'os meiser, you should not let those sit in your general account. That money should be earmarked for tzedakah, for meiser, immediately. Once you have that, a person is permitted to be strategic about how they want to spend those funds, right? Well, I don't know. I don't know what I want to do with it yet. I don't know where I want to give it. I don't know what need is going to come up. So you have the right to hold on to it, to be strategic. But the obligation to separate out that money into a Meiser account or a tzedakah account, that is a chiyuv. That is a chiyuv. It's also good tzedakah financial planning, because monies which remain mixed with your general usage monies, we run the risk of just losing track of everything. So the creation of a separate tzedakah account means those monies are set aside for tzedakah immediately. I'm in fulfillment of the words of the Gemara, but I have the right, the license to be strategic with how I go ahead and spend those funds. Now, that being said, there is still a concept of going ahead and dispensing your tzedakah in an expeditious, timely fashion. But a person doesn't have to give it to the first cause that comes their way. You are permitted to be strategic, but again, strategic and timely at the same time. And there's so much to speak about with that, but say every different time. Amar Rava, Kevan Shavar Lav Ragal Achar Al Rabasei. So once it comes along Rava, and Rava says, by the way, Rava was one of the 5 opinions. Rava said, once one regel passes, you're in violation of Bal Ta'acher. Meisvei, hey Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Papis, Avlad Shlam Shiyakriv O Shlamim. So I'll say Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Papis said that the offspring of a Shlamim is also a Shlamim. Rabbi Papis, Ani Meid, Shahaisalanu Para Shalzivche Shlamim. We once had a para that was Shlamim. Va'achlunu b'Pesach, and the para before we offered it gave birth. Va'achandu v'lada Shlam b'Chag, and we ate its offspring as Shlamim b'Chag. Now we'll say b'Chag b'Pashtas means what? Sukkis. So they had the mother on Pesach, and the child on Sukkis. I understand why they weren't able to offer up the offspring on Pesach as shlamim, because maybe the baby was too young. You can't offer up an animal as a carbon less than 8 days old. However, but Rava, you just said before that you can't go more than 1 regel. If the offspring of a shlamim is a shlamim, and you ate the mother on Pesach, when should you have to eat the child by? Shavuos. To which the Gemara says, what's the case? The case is where the baby was ill during Shavuos. So therefore it could not be offered up during Shavuos. What does it mean when it says that we ate the baby? B'chag, the Gemara says, Chag Shavuos. It doesn't mean Chag of Sukkis, it means Chag HaShavuos. But the other opinion say, V'idach, then that's not true. Kalecha de Tani Pesach, Tani Atzeres. That's not the way the Yom Tovim are referred to. Right? So whenever you're talking about Pesach, Shavuos is always referred to as Atzeres, not as Chag, and Sukkis is referred to as Chag. In any event, I will say, you have this is the position of Rabbah, which we do not hold like. Again, we'll see the halacha l'maisa. Actually, I take that back. I shouldn't say that. We'll see what we do with Rava. But this is the opinion of Rava, who says that you're in violation of Bal Ta'acher after the passage of 1 regel. Next, Rava Amar, Kevan Shavra Alav Gimel Regalim B'chol Yom V'Yom over B'Bal Ta'acher. Both say this is incredible. Rava says, by the way, once you pass 3 regalim, right? Let's go with the general approach, which was two out of the 5 subscribe to the 3 regal criteria. Both the Tanakama as well as Reb Shimon. They disagreed you need 3 in order, not in order, but let's just go with 2 out of the 5 agreed you need 3 regalim. Comes along Rava and says, by the way, once you pass 3 regalim, you violate Bal Ta'acher every single day you have not offered up the carbon. Which I will say is very dramatic. There are very few Averis like that. There are some like that, like Bris Milah is like that, right? That after a child, right, after every day after the 8th day, there's a chiyah for the parents. After the age of bar mitzvah, there's a chiyah for the child. But this is a fascinating idea. Every single day after that 3rd regal, you're in violation of Bal Ta'acher every day. The Gemara says, really? Meisvei, echad bachar ve'echad kala kodshim, whether it's bachar or all other sacrificial items, kevan she'avra aleim shana below regalim. Listen to this. Once they pass a year, right? This is the bachar. The bachar is supposed to be offered up within the year. Once, or kodshim for them, and all other karbanos. Once you pass by a year, even below regalim, even if you go through a year and you don't have all 3 regalim, or regalim below shana, or all 3 regalim without a year, over b'bal ta'acher. Ultimately, you're in violation of Bal Ta'acher. Okay, how is this a kasha? V'hai mai tiyufte. What's the question? In other words, we'll say, Rava made a statement. Once you go past 3 regalim, you're violation of Bal Ta'acher each and every day. The Gemara now quotes this brisa as a kasha. What's the kasha? Amrav can tell you. Man de kamosif shapir kamosif. The one who asked the question asked a good question. Why? Michti tana alavi kamahader. Sirabo saying, the Bryce is coming to tell me that whether you wait a year without 3 regalim, we'll define these terms, or 3 regalim without a year, right after that you're over in Bal Ta'acher. So we'll say, it only says Bal Ta'acher once. Listni b'chol yom v'yom over Bal Ta'acher. Why doesn't it say you're in violation of Bal Ta'acher every single day? In other words, from the Bryce, what it makes it sound like is once a year passes or 3 regalim pass, whichever one, whether it's a year without 3 regalim or 3 regalim without a year, at the end of you're over in Bal Ta'acher. But it sounds like you're over Bal Ta'acher how often? How often? Once. Rav, if you are correct, it should say you're over in Bal Ta'acher every single day. The Idach, Rav will respond to that. That's not a good question. Tana lemikve balav kamahader, balavi yiselo kamahader. The Tana is only coming to teach you about a general prohibition. He's not coming to teach you about how many prohibitions you're over. So all he's coming to teach you is whether you have 1 year that elapses without 3 regalim, or 3 regalim which elapse without 1 year, you're in violation. The Tana is not coming to tell you you're in violation every single day. He may agree with that premise, but that's not the piece of information he's coming to convey. He's coming to convey either a year without 3 regalim or 3 regalim without a year triggers Bal Ta'acher. So I'll say, let's analyze this a little bit, because this is quite fascinating. So Gufa. So but therefore we'll say, Rava's statement remains unchallenged, which is that once you go ahead and you hit the threshold of Bal Ta'acher, you now violate Bal Ta'acher each and every subsequent day. But let's analyze this brisa. Gufa echad b'char ve'echad kol kodshim, whether it's b'char, all other karbanos, kevan shavra aleim shana below regalim, if you go ahead and you miss a year, or a year passes by, even without the regalim, or the regalim below shana, or you pass by 3 regalim without the year, over b'Bal Ta'acher, you're in violation of Bal Ta'acher. So let's analyze this. Bishlam regalim below shana mishkachasla. I understand the case of the passage of 3 regalim without a year. Right? Also remember again, the regalim pretty much happen within 6 months of each other. Right? So you could definitely have the passage of 3 regalim without a year. Ela shana below regalim heichim mishkachasla. But let's say, how do you ever have a year? How do you ever go by a year without all 3 regalim? Watch this. So, if you like the position of Reb Shimon, that halacha l'maisa, it's not just 3 regalim. What do you need? Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos. So we spoke about this. Remember again, in Reb Shimon's model, sometimes you could have up to 5 regalim until you're in violation of Bal Ta'acher. That could definitely be more than a year. So that I understand, that you could have a year without 3 regalim. But according to everyone else, well, according to Tanakama, who requires 3 regalim but doesn't require them to be in the order of Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, how do you ever have a year without 3 regalim? So watch this. According to Rebbe, you can find it in a leap year. How so? This Rabbi says a fascinating discussion. This Sanya, Shana Tamima. Rabbi says the pasuk says a complete year. What is this talking about? Look in Rashi, Shana Tamima. Ha'amura babate arechoma. Rabbi says, listen to this. If you sell a home in a walled city, there's an interesting halacha that says you have up to, you, the seller, have up to 1 year to redeem it. And if you don't redeem it within that year, what happens? What happens? It becomes the property of the purchaser for how long? Forever. It does not revert back to its owner during Yovel, right? By other real estate transactions, they revert back to their owners by Yovel. That keeps the territorial balance, right? In alignment. But in a walled city, you have 1 year to redeem. If you don't redeem within the year, lechalutin, it goes forever to the purchaser. So Rashi says over here, so let's listen to this. So Rebbe Omer, Mona, how do you calculate the year for Bate Arechoma? So Omer, Mona Gimel Meos Shishin Chamish Yom Kamin Yemos Achama. So we'll say Rebbe says, interestingly enough, it's a solar year, not a lunar year, 365 days. So you have 365 days from the day of the sale in order for you, the seller, to redeem your property. If you don't redeem your property, it belongs to the purchaser forever. The Chum say, no. Mona Yud Beis Chodesh B'Yom Yom. The Chum say, no. We count 12 months. It's a calendar year. We count 12 months, Miyom Liyom. So if you sell it on the 10th of Cheshvan, you have until the 10th of Cheshvan the following year to go ahead and buy back your property. What happens if this Abra Shana? What happens if it's an Uber yard, right? What happens if it's a leap year? So there's an extra Adar. Good. Nis Abralo. That's the benefit the seller, right? The seller now has an extra month of redemption. So we'll say, now watch this. So you could have a year without 3 regalim, according to Rebbe. How so? Mishkachas Rebbe, watch this. The Kadsha Basar Chagamatzos. Imagine for a moment you went ahead and you are makdish the karban after Pesach. And Rabbi say, and after Pesach, and the following year is a leap year. The adar basra shana malaya. By the time you get to the end of the last adar in the following year, it'll be a complete year. But yet, interestingly enough, regalim lamalu. But you will not have had all of the regalim. El Rabbanon, because obviously you're missing Pesach. El Regalim, El Rabbanon, Heichim Mishkachslu. But according to the Rabbanon, how do you ever have a case of a year without 3 Regalim? This is very interesting. Kidetani Rabbi Shmaya will say this is absolutely fascinating. Kidetani Rabbi Shmaya, Atzeres, Shavuos will say this is fascinating. Shavuos does not have a calendar date in the Torah. Right? Shavuos only has, when is Shavuos? According to our Torah, when is Shavuos? The 50th day. Right? The 50th day. By the way, it's absolutely fascinating. Every other Yom Tov in the Torah has a calendar date. Shavuos does not. Which leads us to say this is wild. Rav Shmaya says, Atzer Shavuos, Pamim Hey, Pamim Shisha, Pamim Shiva. Sometimes Shavuos is the 5th of Sivan, sometimes it's the 6th of Sivan, and sometimes it's the 7th of Sivan. It's different days wild, but absolutely wild. So the says, HaKohen, how does this work? Shnei and Malayan, if ultimately Nisan and Iyar are both 30-day months, Chamisha, then Shavuos will fall out on the 5th of Sivan. Shnei and Chaserin, if Nisan and Iyar are both 29 days, Shiva. Ultimately, Shavuos will be on the 7th of the month of Sivan. Echad Mali ve'echad Chaser. Ultimately, again, if one is Mali, one is Chaser. Ultimately, Shisha. Sefer will say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, according to the Chachamim, you could have the same situation as well, depending on how Shavuos falls out. Interestingly enough, ultimately, you could have a full year without 3 regalim as well. So who argues Rabbi Shmaya? Achirim hidisanya. Achirim omrim. The Achirim say, Ein bein atzeres la'atzeres ela ein bein Hashana l'Hashana ela daled yamim bilvad. Ultimately, again, the Achirim disagree. They say the only difference between Shavuos between year 1 and year 2, or Hashana between year 1 and year 2, is 4 days. The way the Yom Tovim work out is they fall out 4 days later than the day before. And ultimately, again, if it was a leap year, ultimately 5 days. So therefore, you begin to see that both according to Rebbe as well as according to the Chachamim, interestingly enough, you could have a situation of a year without 3 regalim. So I will say this is now something new, because what the Gemara just introduced us to is something dramatic, which is that halacha l'maisa, bal ta'acher could be triggered either by the passage of 3 regalim or by the passage of a year, even if that year does not have 3 regalim. We'll have to stop here for today. We'll pick up with Rabbi Zira and Meir Hashem tomorrow, and I will say we will do Meir Hashem on Sunday. We'll do the halacha l'maisa by Baal Ta'acher, because there's a lot of stuff that's floating. There's a lot of shitos that are floating around over here. Meir Hashem will consolidate and come to a l'maisa and Meir Hashem over the weekend. Shkach Abosai.